Surprise! I have a second Christmas video for you. Yesterday, I explored potential consequences of Germany's Schlieffen Plan, their plan to swiftly overwhelm France, capture Paris, and destroy most of the French army, being a whopping success, causing the collapse of France and a negotiated peace with Russia and Britain, the war ending before Christmas. But something that is much less discussed is what if the opposite happened? What if the Entente had achieved a swift victory? Now, the main issue with such scenarios is that unlike the Germans, the Entente just don't have a war plan to win this fast. In fact, a lot of the Entente advantages lay in the long term. Allow Russia to mobilize their population, allow the British to blockade and starve out the Germans, etc. The closest thing we have to something like this would be the French war plan, Plan 17. Yet, this was a terrible plan. It essentially just amounted to, let's gather our forces on the Franco-German border and then we invade. This invasion was to occur simultaneously with a Russian invasion from the east. And that is basically everything that was concretely planned, with the specifics being up to Marshal Joffre to figure out as war began. In our timeline, the plan mainly failed in three ways. First, it way overestimated the early Russian offensives, which were wiped out by minor German forces. Second, it was extremely predictable, attacking into fortified German positions, while the Germans themselves had more and better troops on their offensive. Finally, France lacked the reconnaissance and the communication. After they mounted minor offensives in our timeline, they were swiftly pushed back to their own borders. By every single metric, the French plan failed immensely. Yet today we ask, what if Plan 17 was a success? Much like how we made the Schlieffen Plan succeed yesterday. Now frankly, I am not educated enough on the specifics of the militaries of the two sides to explain in depth, battle by battle, how we could make this happen. We will just assume that the Germans are more incompetent and have worse defenses, while we're assuming that the French are just somehow prepared better. Again, the specifics don't really matter too much, it's about the outcome. Let's see how it works out. At the start of the war, Germany boldly breaks through into Belgium, getting ready to march to Paris. But then, France breaks through in Alsace. Germany tries to continue their offensive, but the French pressure is way stronger than expected, and Germany is forced to redirect forces to hold their flanks. But, for a while, still believed that they might come out on top. But the French advance is just too strong. Germany is forced to pull back from their Schlieffen Plan or risk military disaster. The German Western Army is in total disarray and they suffer massive losses while retreating from Belgium, before eventually settling into defensive positions across Germany and eastern Belgium, where they finally fight the French to a standstill. Even worse, the Russians would have been moving around this time too. In our timeline, the Russians moved into Prussia only to be evicted by just 20% of the German army. This, from the start, put the initiative with the Germans, basically ruining any Russian threat on Germany. It would be better if instead the Russians moved slower, avoiding decisive battles and just focusing on the threat of invasion instead. Against Austria is where Russia should really focus. And much like in our timeline, they destroy the Austro-Hungarian armies, devastating a third of their forces and capturing many of the officers of their army. This was a defeat that even in our timeline, the Austrians never fully recovered from, while the damage dealt meant that Austria mostly had to give up on conquering Serbia in the short term. By now, the Germans need to face a tough reality. Their western offensive had failed spectacularly, and even now they are struggling with halting the offensive fully. The German army is still fighting, but the losses, especially in terms of equipment, were massive. Meanwhile, they have to completely rebalance their armies, causing chaos, paranoia, and even defeatism amongst the German ranks. Germany began to seriously consider maybe it would be better to just surrender now. Of course, hypothetically speaking, and we won't be doing this for thematic reasons today, let's swiftly explore what it might look like if Germany even now refused to surrender, which is not impossible considering their leadership. Now, the entire dynamic of the war has flipped. In our timeline, Germany was in northern France. They were in Belgium. In the minds of many Germans, as long as they just held these positions, they'd eventually win the war. This concept was further reinforced by the Russian Revolution, leaving Germany in control over Eastern Europe. For most of the war, Germany assumed that if they just held on to this territory, the Entente would eventually be forced to negotiate. This led to Germany, generally, committing far less to massive offensive into Western trenches. That doesn't mean that they didn't attack ever, but for the most part, it was up to the West to break the stalemate, not up to Germany. This is also why German losses on the Western Front generally remained lower than the losses which the Entente sustained. If Germany did continue this war, this logic would be flipped. The French would be mostly happy to entrench themselves in Alsace and the Saarland, only committing to minor probing attacks into the north, but mostly content to just sit there and watch Britain establish their blockade of Germany. The clock was ticking, everyone would know this, and waiting wouldn't favor the Germans. They would have to somehow break this stalemate, while fewer forces could fight in Russia, not just because Germany has to break the Entente, but also because if the Entente did regain the initiative, Germany's largest industrial area would be under threat. Even better for the Entente, with Belgium mostly liberated, convincing the Dutch to adhere to the British blockade becomes much simpler. Quite simply put, the Entente have all the advantages, and this is not a war that the Germans will win. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. But for the sake of this video, we will assume that the German leadership realizes the direness of their situation, and specifically reaches out to Britain for a settlement, who Germany trusted far more to come up with a fair arrangement than the other Entente powers. Frantic negotiations begin, not just between the two warring parties, but also within the alliances themselves. What was the minimum the Entente would accept? What was the most the Central Powers could accept losing? Do the Central Powers remain strong together or negotiate separately? And most importantly, what should a post-war world look like? Crucially, the peace after such a short war would likely be much lighter on Germany than Versailles was in our timeline. Now you might remember that I, yesterday, argued the opposite, that short wars don't mean light peaces by themselves. But there is a difference between the German position here and the French position after a fully successful Schlieffen. German army would be relatively more intact. Germany would still be in control over most of their important territories, as well as their own capital, and Germany is in a better position to at least threaten to continue the war. Perhaps more importantly though, is Britain. Britain is not in this war to see Russia and France partition Germany and dominate the continent instead. Britain was in this war in an attempt to stabilize Europe and weaken, but not necessarily destroy Germany. Even after 4 years of war with Germany, the British still held a quite lenient stance on negotiations, being especially sympathetic to Germany after the conflict. If France and Russia demanded too much, it is far from impossible that Britain threatens to leave the war, very much complicating the conflict for the rest, with a non-trivial chance for the Central Powers to rebound. This would be an outcome that nobody would wish for, so we can assume that the Central Powers get off relatively light. So let's start partitioning. What do they lose? First, almost definitely Bosnia. Austria had only officially annexed the region in 1908, and it was the region that started this whole mess in the first place. To Serbia it goes. Then, the loss of Alsace is likewise guaranteed. It was one of the biggest motivators for the Franco-German rivalry. After this though, it gets significantly more difficult, as a lot of territories would be up for debate. In the case of France, I can imagine that they at least heavily push for the Saar Basin too, a region famed for its coal production, thereby giving a huge boost to France's energy independence. But if accepted, greater concessions along the Rhine would definitely be blocked by the British. That moves us to Russia, who also needs concessions. And here we need to address an important point. Do the Ottomans join the war? I have kept them neutral for the sake of this scenario, as I think that even the most radical, pro-German forces in the Empire would have major doubts after seeing the Western fronts collapse. However, if, somehow, the Ottomans did join the war, we can expect Russia to not gain too much from the Germanics, as they would instead focus on expansion to the south. But, again, I doubt this would be the case, and we need to look at what Russia is likely to gain. Memel, East Prussia, Posen, Silesia and Galicia were all regions which Russia would want, but Britain would absolutely not accept them getting all of it. Beyond that, at this point, I think Germany would rather implode than cede Prussia without a fight to the death. Silesia then is a very industrial region, so Britain and Germany might consider it too important to give up to Russia. Memel is decently likely to be taken, which just leaves Posen and Galicia. I feel that, considering the stronger position Germany was in compared to Austria, as well as the fact that Germany already lost important land in the west, Galicia being taken, but not Posen, is very plausible, though I might be overestimating British influence here. Colonially, Germany might be mostly spared. Small Togo was the only colony already occupied by the Entente, and it would either fully pass to Britain, since they don't get anything in Europe, or it would be split with the French, like in our timeline. Beyond that, I doubt Germany loses too much in Africa. Britain might want East Africa, but I doubt that they'd really push all too hard for it. Maybe just trying to get concessions in the West for the Cape to Cairo connection, but even then, I think it's mostly left alone. In the Pacific, Japan would have joined the war before the German collapse, and they'd likely still seize Micronesia, while New Guinea and most of the other islands are taken too, with the Japanese likewise seizing Qingdao from Germany, mostly ending the German presence in the Asia-Pacific region. With something like this as a peace deal, how might Europe recover from such a conflict? Well, the fascinating nature of such scenarios is that despite losing, Germany gets to continue mostly as they had pre-war. Their position is of course weakened, but it is not destroyed. The German government and military gets a serious dent in their prestige, but this swift defeat doesn't necessarily lead to a German revolution and the abolition of the monarchy. Germany is, functionally, mostly as powerful as it had been before the war, and nobody will deny that they are still a great European power. But Germany is not free of consequences. Pre-war, the traditional German elites who controlled the government were increasingly at odds with the German Reichstag. You see, on paper the German Empire was a democracy, but in practice, their system was so dysfunctional that the Kaiser's government mostly ruled without parliament. This was for a rather simple reason. Parties more aligned with the Kaiser's government were a clear minority, while parties opposing them made up the vast majority, with specifically the Social Democrats becoming the biggest bloc. This led to the government often having to go around parliament, managing to keep them off their backs, mostly by playing them off against each other. After losing this war, it is far from unthinkable that especially the Socialist Party attempts to propagandize this against the government, potentially leading to yet further growth of anti-government parties, a trend which the German elite would eventually need to find an answer to, either by actually embracing democracy, reforming their blatantly unfair district system, which leads to highly unfair seat-to-vote share ratios, mostly by grouping pro-socialist regions, like major cities, into few highly populated districts, while more small, less populated rural areas likely to vote conservative are created. Yet, doing something like this would require a significant change in the mindset from the Kaiser and his allies. The other option is for the elites to sideline the Reichstag even more, creating a yet more autocratic Germany, which may yet in the future lead to issues for the state. Either way, these are very much long-term political issues. As to the immediate post-war world, Imperial Germany mostly continues as it has. That moves us to Austro-Hungary, which very much is at the center of this scenario, with the question on everyone's mind: do they collapse? Does the old empire have it in them to survive such a humiliating loss? not just to Russia, but also to Serbia? I think it is unlikely. Austro-Hungary started this war. They lost a third of their army to Russia, as well as a large part of their officer corps, and they then had to give up Galicia and Bosnia. These losses would be significant for two reasons. Before the war, Austria held a significant population advantage over Hungary. This would now be completely wiped out, as Hungary didn't lose anything themselves. Beyond that, Hungary was significantly less enthusiastic about this war, and you can bet that they play on that in their now more powerful position. Of course, the other nationalities of the empire might get some plans too. Within the Austrian portion, for example, the German population has far more power now that the Poles and Ukrainians are gone. For both Germans and Hungarians, this loss might cement the same conclusion. The empire no longer works, with Hungary trying to move towards independence, while the Germans of Austria could potentially look towards Germany itself, with the other minorities positioning themselves in this coming conflict, while the nations surrounding the empire, emboldened by the decline of the Germans as the guarantors of Austria, might get more aggressive themselves. We shall return to this potential conflict later. That moves us to Russia, which is now in a far stronger position. By no means are all of their problems solved, but they are at least put on hold, as this great victory emboldens Nicholas's position within the empire. In the short term, high on success, Tsar Nicholas has the time to reform his nation. Will he do so in any significant way? No, he had no intention to. But at least Russia is not in a position for a short-term collapse, and they can continue to throw around their significant power. France is mostly content with the gains that they made. Sure, they would have liked more influence over the Rhineland, but nobody would have dared dream of the swift and decisive victory that the French accomplished in this war. And euphoric would be the best description for the French attitude. Even better, the war barely entered their soil. So unlike our timeline, the French industry and economy would still be fully functioning. We can expect the German-French rivalry to continue, but with a lot less passion from the French side. If you ask the average Frenchman, there is no need for a rivalry anymore, because France has already won. The Franco-Russian alliance persists, but unlike before the war, where France felt it was pretty reliant on Russia, the importance of this partnership for Paris decreases, and we shouldn't expect France to unconditionally back any Russian actions or expansions. That leaves Britain, which arguably won the most out of all of the great powers. They joined the war, barely had to fight, reduced the power of their main rival, and because they had a place at the peace table, they prevented the French and Russians from becoming too powerful as well. After the war, Britain has far less of a reason to consider Germany their main rival, especially if Germany's only main ally collapses. This likely means that Britain can move back to a more neutral position, evaluating their alliances with mainly Russia, because, as we will soon see, they could very swiftly snowball into becoming the next big threat to European balance. The British relationship with Japan might for that same reason remain strong, as with the increase of instability in China, which Russia will almost certainly make use of, Britain would like to see Japan as a counter to Russia in the region. The final nation that is significantly impacted would be Serbia. They have grown more powerful, but most importantly, much more assertive. The rise to power that Serbia had in the years prior to and now after the Great War was impressive and relatively painless. In a few decades, Serbia has defeated all of their rivals, coming out larger and more powerful than ever. They might now start looking at binding Montenegro closer to themselves, while ensuring Bulgaria is kept down by the Balkan League. Serbia might grow belligerent to Albania, a nation that is only as big as it is because of Austro-Hungary, and most of its neighbors wouldn't mind taking a bite out of it, while Serbia is also a lot more confident in the support they might get from their Russian benefactor, which is very important as their attention remains fixated on the Austro-Hungarian Empire, now confident in their ability to liberate the remaining of their southern Slavic brethren. Which finally leads us to the, in my opinion, extremely likely Habsburgs collapse. Almost certainly, the incentive for this collapse comes from Hungary trying to get independence or an even looser connections to the Habsburgs in Vienna. The death of Franz Joseph in 1916 could be an excellent time for this, exploiting the youth and inexperience of the new Kaiser, as opposed to Franz Joseph, which, having ruled for 68 years, had a far greater degree of respect surrounding him. The new Kaiser immediately gets hounded by Hungarian demands for further independence, demands for closer integration into Germany, various calls for autonomy by minorities, and an explicitly hostile Serbia on their border. This is not an enviable position to be in. The specific way the empire collapses is difficult to tell. The pro-independence Hungarian opposition had at the start of the war reached out to the Entente and Italy for support for independence. Perhaps the former Entente sponsors them attempting a coup or a revolution in Budapest, and when Austria attempts to quash it, the Entente can essentially say, "Stop, or we will get a rerun of 1914, essentially daring the Austrians and Germans to start another conflict, which more likely they would not dare to, very possibly forcing the Kaiser to abandon Hungary. Of course, that is just one of the ways for Austria-Hungary to end. I am not a fortune teller, there are near infinite ways for the collapse to specifically go. It might just be Hungary leaving, with the rest of Austria becoming a German puppet. It might be a more confusing and violent affair, with various nations expanding their power. Does Czechia get independence? Perhaps under a real historical plan to crown a Russian prince. Does Russia remain allied to Hungary for convenience, or do they betray them to empower their more traditional allies? The exact variation of post-Habsburg borders are impossible to say, so I will not predict anything too specific. This collapse of Austria-Hungary would historically be coupled together with the First World War as the aftermath of the same event. Though it is important to note that the war would likely never be called the First World War, and might not even be called the Great War, as it really was a pretty run-of-the-mill conflict, all things considered. Depending on where you might live, it might be called the Third Balkan War, the Second Franco-German War, the Continental Intervention, or any number of names. Either way, this unilateral Russian, French and Italian support for the destruction of Austria-Hungary, whatever form it specifically takes, confirms for Britain one thing. Now that Germany is not a direct threat, France and especially Russia need to be seen as threats to European balance. And as Britain sees Russia's influence rise from Prague to the Adriatic, it becomes very clear that it is St. Petersburg that they need to focus on now. Quite possibly, this leads to them increasing their partnership with Germany, whom they may even allow to absorb Austria. Britain, Germany, Japan, as well as potentially nations like the Ottomans and Italy, slowly get absorbed into a new diplomatic network in Europe. But it is far more complicated than the one from before the war. Britain may be allied to Germany, but they wouldn't be a fan of the Germans coming out of any war as the masters of Eastern Europe either. Similarly, is France even still willing to join Russia if the Russians do aggressively start a conflict? It might be very likely that Russia, after all of these immense victories, realizes their difficult position and returns to a more peaceful, compromising foreign policy, maintaining their sphere, but ensuring that they don't give Britain a motive for joining Germany in an aggressive conflict. Of course, considering the amount of uncertainties, I don't have an answer to any of this. What does seem likely though, is that we are looking at a frankly confusing 1920s and 30s. The issues that led to World War I barely being solved by this brief war, but simply being moved, as pre-World War I geopolitics essentially continues into the following decades. God can only hope that the conflict of 1914 wasn't just a taste of a much more destructive conflict further down the line. For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, then I'm sure that the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.